Parents booted me out at 18 and left me homeless. 10 years later and they lost everything to 2020 bankruptcy, so they broke into my home to squat while I was away, by user Clabbage Cobbler. This is a rant story. And I just need a place to vent this. I don't want to reveal any details that would get me recognized. Especially by my parents if they happen to be on Reddit. So please, no one ask for any details I don't already provide in this post. I'm 30 male, and my parents didn't really want kids. I was an only child, and pretty much an accidental pregnancy from what relatives have told me as my parents claimed that they were going to be child-free when they married. My childhood was initially good. But I think after I started growing out of the cute and adorable phase, my parents were less inclined to spend time with me. They both worked, and had their own business that they started together. That business was their life, and I was always second fiddle to it. Any other close members of family like my grandparents lived states away, and I barely knew anything about them till I was an adult. So I had no other family around my entire childhood. I was practically raised by TV and my school teachers. My own birthdays by the time I became a teenager were often spent without my parents as they'd just give me some money and tell me to go out and buy whatever I wanted. It was more or less the same with Christmas, and sometimes even back to school shopping. We wouldn't have even had a Christmas tree after I turned 10 if it weren't for the fact I convinced my parents to buy a fake one I could build up and then take apart later every year. If I were to describe my parents, think of them as those people who always wear black, drink lots of wine, and look down their noses at people. And the last I saw of my parents, they still looked and acted the same way. Although my father was always wearing a toupee now. When I turned 16 I asked my parents if I could work part-time for them at their business. And they just told me they had no open positions or anything like that. They may as well have just come right out and said they didn't want me there. After I turned 18 my parents told me that since I was an adult, they expected me to move out as soon as I was able. I was working part-time because I was still in high school. And I didn't have anywhere near enough saved for college. And not long after high school ended my parents told me to pack up and move out. They got an official eviction notice that gave me 30 days and everything. They didn't even help me move. I had to get help from a friend's dad who owns a truck. I ended up renting a crappy apartment and working retail. I had no real life experience and no time for college. Then after just a few months I got fired because my manager legitimately had it out for me and wrote me up for the stupidest things. I don't even remember what they were anymore. But I wasn't the only one the manager treated that way. I called corporate about it and so did a few other people. Corporate looked into the manager, and they were soon fired for various reasons. Not many of which I actually know since it was mostly kept quiet. But someone told me theft of cigarettes was a part of it. And the manager was a chain smoker. Corporate refused to rehire me and only said that they'd change the record to say I was laid off instead of terminated so my resume would still be clean. Guess they considered me damaged goods or something. I ended up going broke pretty fast because I was terrible at managing my own money and couldn't find steady employment. So I lost my apartment. I went back to my parents begging for help, but they refused to take me in. Not even for a little while to get back on my feet. I ended up homeless and living out of a tent in someone's backyard, in winter. My friends had all moved on to college, some in other states, and I was a broke kid taking whatever work I could to stay alive. My salvation came when one of the neighbors of my parents found out I was living out of a tent and offered to take me in for a little while so I wouldn't freeze. She helped me badger my parents into telling me how to get in touch with the other members of my estranged family. My parents did not want to say. My guess is out of fear of being judged for throwing their son out the way they did. But they coughed up the info and gave me a list of contact details. And then told me not to bother them ever again. I called my grandparents from my father's side of the family, and they were very surprised and happy to hear from me because they hadn't seen me since I was an infant. And I'm their only grandchild. My grandparents, after finding out my situation, flew me over to live with them as soon as they could. They basically adopted me. My parents didn't even see me off at the airport despite being invited to. I had zero contact with them for pretty much a decade. My grandparents said they despised my parents for treating me so poorly, and legally disowned them by striking them from their wills. My parents, I'm told, were not happy to hear that. But also said it didn't really matter because they were plenty well off and didn't need anything from my grandparents. How wrong that statement turned out to be. After about a year of living with my grandparents I was able to afford to start going to community college. I got an associate's degree, got a decent job thanks to a recommendation from my grandpa, and eventually my grandparents offered to sell me their house so they could retire to Arizona. My grandma wanted to live in a warmer climate as the cold winter was getting harder and harder on her health every year. I was sad to see them go. But I happily bought the house. They sold it to me for 1/3 its value. And I'll have it paid off in a few more years. My job has me going away on the road periodically. So I can end up away from home for weeks at a time. Not that I mind the travel. I have no pets or a girlfriend, or anything like that. I wouldn't have time for them right now. But in a few years when I have some things in order I'll make time. I don't want to stay a lonely bachelor forever. Then one day in late 2020 I came home after being away for over 2 weeks, only to find a large white van I did not recognize in my driveway. I was getting ready to call police when I noticed the van had the logo from my parents' business on the side of it. And I felt dread. Yes, my parents were there. They'd broken in somehow and were living out of my home. And they had the nerve to greet me like we were buddy the moment I walked in. I told them to get the hell out, and they refused because it was Grandma and Grandpa's house. I said it wasn't their house anymore. They'd sold it to me when they retired. They'd have known that if they were in any way involved with my life. But they threw me to the wolves 10 years prior with no life experience. We argued and they refused to leave. My father told me it was his parents' house first. And that meant he and my mother had the right to live there if they wanted. I walked right into my bedroom, locked the door and called the police. When the cops showed up they were of no help. My parents claimed to them that they had already been there long enough to have residency, which was a complete lie. But I had no cameras to prove they weren't there a month. My neighbors had no cameras either. So it was my word against my parents over how long they'd really been there, and they were claiming squatters' rights. They told police they had a verbal rental agreement with me, and that I was trying to illegally evict them for no reason. My mother even put on the waterworks when saying that. The police told me it was a family dispute, and to file eviction with the courts to get them out. And this was in 2020. Getting to court for anything took longer because of the pandemic. Meanwhile my parents are squatting in my house rent-free and rubbing it in my face. From the information I got out of them, their business went bankrupt and they sold off almost everything they had to pay their debts. All they had left was the van and a few personal belongings. So they expected to live in my house rent-free for the foreseeable future. They were working too. Both of them soon got new jobs. My father as a delivery driver, my mother as a sales associate. They were making money, and the only things they contributed to was electricity and water utilities. Which was basically just handing me a $100 bill every month and saying I should be grateful they were paying me anything. Anytime I tried to discuss proper rent with them, they just said I owed it to them to live rent-free because I took 18 years of their lives. And it's not like they were demanding the money back for that time. Then threatened to stop helping with the utilities altogether. I was so at my wits' end that I ended up calling my grandparents to explain the situation to them. They were very unhappy, and spoke with my parents. But my parents still said they had the right to stay in my home. And refused to budge. My grandpa told me he was sorry it'd come to this. And that if they hadn't sold me the house, my parents wouldn't have invaded. I told him not to worry. I'd already filed for a legal eviction, and would get it soon enough. And my parents already knew that they were on borrowed time. I made sure to say that in earshot of my parents too. They responded with the silent treatment. My father was away most of the time driving a delivery vehicle 6 days a week, which was a job really not to his liking. And my mother basically tried to take over my house in her spare time. She demanded I let her rearrange my living room, and even tried to force me to give her and my father the master bedroom, because they were my parents, and they deserved better, as she put it. I vetoed both of those things and said they don't deserve better, and to stop trying to act like I owe them anything. I didn't ask to be born. And it's a normal obligation for parents to raise their own children. And all they were doing was trying to assert dominance to try and keep me from kicking them out. Finally, after 4 months and now into early 2021, I managed to take my parents to court over their squatting. We only needed to go to court because they fought the eviction and tried to gaslight me into rescinding it. They tried to use the fact it was formerly my grandparents' house, and the fact that they were giving me $100 a month as some sort of leverage of residency. But there was no real rental agreement. And they were smart enough not to try and forge one, as that would have been fraud. So the judge ordered that they needed to be out in a maximum of 30 days because they have zero claim on my house. After court they confronted me and said they were disappointed in me for kicking out my own flesh and blood. I couldn't help but laugh and called them hypocrites because that's exactly what they did to me without a care in the world for my well-being. They had no love for me, so I have no love for them. I owed them nothing. They just tried to act like everything that was mine is theirs. But they had no right to call themselves my parents because they've never really acted like it. I called them a pair of snob-lying narcissists to their faces, and told them to get their affairs in order. Because they already know I won't hesitate to call police if they don't leave my house when the 30 days are over. My father looked enraged. But my mother stopped him from saying or doing anything by grabbing his shoulder and shaking her head. He sneered at me and walked away. They left. But not without a lot of tension. That final month was spent with them either guilting me to try and make me change my mind, or completely ignoring me. I put up a calendar in the living room and checked off each day before they had to leave with a red marker. And the exact day they were to be out was marked with a big red circle. I still remember that final day was March 2nd. My parents waited until the exact day they had to leave my home for good before they finally left. Even when all their stuff was out of the house and they were sleeping on the floor in the guest room for a few days. Since they were so convinced they could make me let them stay, they didn't bother to try and look for an apartment until after the court eviction went through. And my mother spent weeks scrambling to find an apartment. They had to get a tiny and crappy studio apartment in the next city over because it was the only thing they could find on such short notice. A lot like what I had to do when I was 18. Quite ironic. I drove my mother over to see it once, and the apartment was terrible. The walls were baby barf green, the carpet looked like it was 20 years old, the only window just had a view of a brick wall outside, there was no dishwasher, the stove was the smallest one I'd ever seen, and the toilet looked like it really needed to be replaced. The walls also did little to stop noise from neighbors. There was already 2 people loudly fighting in the adjacent apartment while we were there. My mother went out of her way to try and give me sad looks while dropping hints that I should be feeling guilty that I was reducing them to live in such a place. But I just acted oblivious to it all until she finally stopped. They signed the lease right away and moved what little stuff they had into the apartment over the weekend. They also ended up demanding the queen-size bed, dresser, and flat-screen TV from my guest room. I told them to just take the damn things because I no longer wanted them in the house after they spent 5 months sleeping in that room. They looked at me like I was treating them as though they were diseased and demanded nothing more. The moment they had to leave for good, I started changing the locks on all exterior doors. All their stuff was at the apartment, and they'd spent their last night in my guest room. They watched me start ripping the old lock off the front door as they were getting into the van. They said nothing, I said nothing. But they just sat and watched me for a while until I had the new doorknob on. Then they finally left. I breathed a massive sigh of relief the second that van went down the road. I figured karma had finally come for them, and they could live under a rock for all I cared. But nope, my grandparents heard from them recently. They'd called them to brag that had a new business similar to their old one in the same state as I'm living in now. And they are basically on track to be right back to where they used to be in life prior to the pandemic. Which was making good money and looking down on others. I've already googled their new business. And it seems like it's doing well. They have many positive reviews and everything. I'm pretty friggin' resentful, truth be told. They put me through being homeless, squatted for next to free at my house for months, then went right back to being the snobby wine drinking business people they used to be. If karma is real, it's taking too damn long. Edit, I would like to thank everyone for all the constructive advice. And many of the points that are being made on selling the house I'm realizing have merit. I've asked my grandparents if it'd be a good idea if I moved closer to them. They told me that if I want to sell the house, then to go right ahead. My parents will have no clue where I am if I move away. So I'm heavily considering it now. I'm gonna see if the company I work for can transfer me down south. I think I wouldn't mind the warmer climate anyway. I've hated winter since the time I had to live in a tent. I don't have many friends where I currently am as I'm kind of a loner. So it wouldn't be too hard to start over somewhere farther away. I'm attached to this house. But it's not like I grew up in it. So I will consider moving. Yes, I understand the need for more cameras, and will be looking into that. As for those wondering how my parents broke in and fooled police. Well, it's stupidly simple. My parents got in through a window I forgot to lock. They just pulled the screen off and opened it to get right in. Then they found my spare house keys I kept hanging on a hook near the kitchen and copied them. When claiming squatters' rights to police as well as saying we had a prior verbal agreement, my parents presented working house keys to the cops and lied their little asses off saying I'd let them move in. My parents had also already filed for an address change with the DMV online before I'd even gotten home, and showed police a printout of that they'd made. And said that their new IDs with my address were soon to be in the mail. The cops just looked annoyed, told me it was a domestic issue, and to file to evict them like a normal person. I wish I'd gotten their badge numbers to report them. Small addition, yes, my parents had their mail redirected to my house. Which is another thing they used to claim residency. The thing is that if they'd lived in my house for more than 30 days with permission, squatters' rights would make them tenants. They claimed they had my permission and used every dirty trick at their disposal to convince police they had the right to be there. There was no way for them to confirm or deny how long my parents had been living in the house. And it turned into a situation of everybody pointing fingers and police didn't know who to believe. That's why I had to go to court to evict them. I did refuse to give my parents the Wi-Fi password while they lived with me though, since they were not contributing to that utility. However, they just used their smartphones to run a mobile hotspot and got internet that way the whole time they were squatting in my house. Those of you saying that I should leave bad reviews, or expose my parents' past, there really is no point. I'm gonna take the high road there and just forget about them. However, if they committed fraud to start that new business of theirs, then I'll get some popcorn when that comes back on them. Because they'd inevitably call someone for help. Edit 2, for those who don't believe the 30-day thing with squatters. Here's a direct USA law on the matter. In most areas, anyone who lives on your property for more than 30 days with permission can claim rights, as in the eyes of the law they become your tenants. When this happens, you will usually need to carry out an eviction procedure. However, in the case where permission was never given and an unoccupied property is forcibly entered and lived in, there are still rules you must follow. My parents falsified permission and lied about how long they'd been in my house. That's why it took 5 months to get rid of them. Now you know. My son shut my mum up, by user Activitathan 7099. My 15-year-old son asked to go out to see one of his friends yesterday. When he came home, my mum asked him why he never asked her for her permission to go out. He said, "Why should I ask you when I only need to ask mum or dad?" I felt so proud of him, as my mum likes to think that he is her child and I was just the incubator that does everything for him. Mother changed the locks while I was out, tries to marry me off the next day. I'm 20F, by user cautious_twist 1795. I went out on a Friday for a few hours with some friends. Just some shopping and catching up. I haven't seen some of them for the last 2 years due to COVID, when we used to hang out almost every week. And I am leaving the country in a few weeks, so we took this opportunity to as a catch-up and farewell party. I was out from late afternoon to about 9/10 p.m, when I got home. I took out my keys to unlock the gate, but it won't fit. I tried to turn the key around, yes, like a USB, thinking it might fit the other way, but still could not fit. I called my mother, she didn't pick up. Called my grandmother, who lives with me, but she was out with her friends as well and won't be home anytime soon. At this point I was pissed. My mother already burned a couple of my work pants the day before cause I refused to wear a dress for work. My line of work requires me to move around a lot, so a dress or office skirt was not suited for my environment. I shook the gate but no one was home. So I picked the lock. I opened the metal gate after a few tries. Luckily the wooden door behind it was not locked. The neighbors did call the police, and of course I had to show them I actually lived there and was my legal address. I took some essentials and went to stay at my friend's house for the night because I couldn't lock the door back and I didn't feel safe in the house without a locked door. The next day my grandmother and I were invited to go to a pre-wedding event. It was kind of a meeting the elders and engaging party/ceremony at a cafe. My mother only sent me this address and time for it. It was perfectly normal for my grandmother to be invited to these things via my mother. My grandmother doesn't know how to use a phone other than basic functions like calling. We showed up on time to the cafe and were escorted to a booth-type seat at the corner of the cafe. The booth already had a lady, mid-40s to 50s, and a guy. I assumed she was the mother and the guy was her son. The moment we sat down, the lady took out a calendar and notepads filled with list of flower arrangements, color schemes, menus, dresses, hairstyles and etc. She introduced her son, who OS 28 BTW, told me what he does for a living, what he studies and where. She thanked me, agreeing to marry him. I looked at her, then to her son, then to the wedding planners and notes. Then did it finally register? Then this was for my wedding. My grandmother was pissed to say the least. I apologized to the lady and said there must be some kind of misunderstanding between us because I came to attend someone's engagement party, not plan my own. And added I was only 20 this year. My grandmother then rudely asked why she thought I would be marrying her son. The lady replied her mother contacted me and said her daughter was looking for a partner and husband to settle down so she, me, could move out. My grandmother calmly said to the lady that she has been lied to and I was not going to be getting married anytime soon. She said her son seems nice and hopes he finds someone who likes him to marry in the future, but it was not going to be me. We got up and left. When we got home, I found New York things stuffed in a black plastic bag beside the door. My grandmother opened the door and told me to bring my stuff in. The moment I stepped through the door, my mother yelled that she put so much effort into finding a guy who would take a girl like me to marry and that Jay should be grateful she didn't just marry me off to an older dude and I should be happy she found someone my age. She told me I embarrassed her because the mother called her and told her what she did was not okay and to not do it again without even asking or informing me properly. My grandmother started to shout at my mother in Cantonese, which resulted in them being in a heated argument for almost 30 minutes, and my grandmother kicked out my mother. Which of course she moaned about and cried about before leaving. TLDR, my mother changed the locks to the house while I was out. And sent me to plan my own wedding under the guise of it being KNE of my grandmother's friend's wedding. Then proceeds to kick me out of the house but ends up being kicked out. Don't want to discipline your child? Fine. Both of you can stay home while we go have fun, by user Ulfer. Small edit for clarification, I'm not actually related to anyone mentioned in the story below. There's a family with a large cabin on a lake who host cookouts and trips on the weekends for their friends. While we're there, all of the kids call all of the adults present uncle or auntie, no matter the blood relation. That's just how they roll. This one's a sad story all around, but it primarily revolves around two kids with very sad stories. Worth noting, the people I was celebrating this Labor Day with have a very it takes a village approach to child minding. An adult is left in charge of a little one, and if the little one and the adult part ways, the adult makes sure a different adult has charge of the kid. Leads to some interesting situations where a kid is missing in action, but we've never actually lost track of one and have a 100% safety rate. Well, aside from trip and falls and scrapes, but that's just the price of doing business when you're little. The first kid is Max, he's 5 and was put in sole custody of his dad after his mom was arrested. He wears a diaper still due to the trauma he suffered, and his dad feels like he failed him and as a result seems to be incapable of disciplining the kid. It's been 2.5 years now and people watch Max like a hawk because he can't be trusted near animals or with other people's things. When caught he turns on the waterworks and his dad doesn't do anything. The second kid is Alicia, and she's 4 and was adopted by a pair of my friends. She's got a speech impediment that her bio parents tried to solve by beating it out of her. When we first met her, everyone was given firm instructions. No using the R word in her presence, at all. For any reason. Second rule? If she feels comfortable enough to speak to you, you listen. Period. Third rule? No surprise hugs, no fist bumps, no high fives. If she's having a good day, low fives are allowed. If she gets triggered, she just shuts down, doesn't cry, doesn't do anything. Doesn't respond to outside stimuli. She just goes away, and it is the saddest thing to see. Sweetest little kid though, her smile lights up the whole room when it comes out. On to the events. Alicia has just hit her Y phase a few years late for obvious reasons, and she'd asked me why she gets shocked by doorknobs while running around in stocking feet. I happen to rather enjoy these questions, and I was in the middle of a talk with her about why that is. She was speaking when Max and his dad arrived. I was down on my haunches and listening very closely when Max runs up and just shoves Alicia to the ground and says, "Shut up, wetod. Uns op, my iPad is broken, can you fix it?" brandishing a tablet at me. I won't lie to you and say it wasn't a struggle to keep my voice even, but I knew yelling would only make things worse for Alicia. Excuse you? I'm not fixing a thing until you apologize to Alicia and wait your turn. But uns op. Might have wet. Apologize and then wait your turn. Then stop calling me uncle and find someone else to fix it. Bullies don't get my help and they certainly don't get to call me uncle. Poor Alicia was just laying where she fell, not even crying. Hadn't sat up, just looked like a robot that had run out of batteries. I scooped her up and told Max, "You stay right here while I find Alicia's mom. This conversation isn't over." He just starts screaming, "No bully! No bully! No bully! No bully!" I snuck inside the house with Alicia where it was quieter for a moment and said, "Alicia, I know you're scared right now, but I need to tell you a secret. Can you nod if you can hear me right now?" This is very important. I got the tiniest little nod, and I told her, Max has the exact same problem talking that you do, and I understand you much better. You can't tell anyone I told you that though, okay? Bless her little heart, she actually whispered, really? Of course. Would I lie to you? Tiny shake of the head. I tracked down her mom outside and gave her the Cliff Notes version of what went down. Mom looked like she wanted to rend Max limb from limb, but I told her the plan. She was appeased. They went someplace quiet so Alicia could come out of her shell, and I went back to where I'd left Max. Max was being held by his dad, and his dad was asking Max what had happened to his tablet, and he was just repeating no Bowie. Apparently after I'd left Max he'd smashed his tablet on the ground, and his dad had no idea what happened. I raised my voice a little so people would pay attention and asked Max to repeat what he'd said to Alicia. He shook his head and started crying, still shouting no Bowie and sobbing hysterically. When I relayed the exact events that happened, his dad had the grace to look ashamed. Come on OP, you know what he went through. Can't we cut him a break? He doesn't know any better. This is the canned response anytime Max is caught doing something like kicking a dog or stealing a toy or phone to play with. I was done. Further discussion ensued that I won't bother relaying, but Max's dad refused to do anything to actually discipline his child, just like every other time Max acts out, but this time we were done. This is so far across the line from acceptable it boggles the imagination. We were planning on doing campfire s'mores after dinner, but I called an audible. New plan is putt-putt golf and then ice cream, and whoever does the best at putt-putt gets the biggest bestest ice cream the place has. Every single adult agreed Max and Max's dad shouldn't come with. They got to stay home and think about what they'd done. Miraculously her recorded scores for putt-putt were 18 hole-in-ones. And listening to her laugh while she tried to contend with an ice cream that was very nearly as big as she was made everyone's night. Max and his dad were gone by the time we got back. I hope his dad gets his act together. Mom tells her child she can get anything she wants in a store, then gets mad when she doesn't get what she wants her to and refuses to buy her anything, by user Valentina Star. One evening while I was working by myself at the store I used to work at, a family comes in. It's a mom and a dad with two girls, one who looks 10 to 12 and one who looks like she's around 7. As they're coming in, the parents tell the girls they can pick out one item in the store. They look around and the younger girl becomes interested in a small keychain makeup palette that's shaped like a flip phone, kid makeup and not real makeup, want to clear that up. Her mom goes into the clearance section and finds another makeup palette that's much bigger and has a lot more product than the one the girl wants. Since the bigger one is in the clearance section, they're roughly the same price. The mom tries to talk her into getting the bigger one, but the girl still wants to get the phone one. Yes, getting the clearance one is more practical, but that one isn't cute like the other one and that's really all a kid that age cares about. The mom starts getting frustrated and I get why. If you're spending money on crap quality kid eyeshadow, you at least want to get a lot of the stuff. I can't remember how much the palettes were, but I think it was around $10 to $15 and nobody wants to spend that much on a little bit of makeup with a nice looking case. However, they did tell the kid she could get anything. From what I saw, no rules, no budget, no limits, and the way I see it, if you are going to give a little girl that kind of absolute freedom you need to accept she's going to get something fun and impractical. The older girl decides she's going to get something at the next store they go to and the parents seem like they're more than ready to leave. The girl isn't picking anything else or agreeing to get the big makeup palette. She just wants the phone. After a little more trying to convince her, the mom just tells the girl she isn't getting her the phone and tells her that if she doesn't the big makeup palette she isn't buying her anything. And the mom's getting pretty angry with her. She asks her one more time if she wants the clearance one and when the girl says no, she says okay, we're leaving. The girl gets really upset. Just before the family finally leaves, the mom says I'm not buying something for you that you're going to lose. The worst part of working in a kid-centric store, which I was at the time, is listening to parents scold or argue with their kids. It's always awkward and you have to pretend you can't hear or see it. Also, if she was worried about the kid losing it, we do have bags. She could also put it in her purse. There are ways to avoid that, just saying. I understand not wanting to buy useless things for your kid, especially if it's something breakable like basically everything we sold in that store, but I just don't think it's fair to tell a kid you'll get them anything they want, then get mad at them for not wanting what you want them to, then refuse to buy them anything.